Hey everybody, welcome back to the Gay Street Studios. Thanks again for being here as usual. It's a really rainy, stormy Wednesday afternoon. Hope you enjoyed the first installment of Hurston. This is our second installment. And it's a wonderful book. I'm sure some of you have read it before. I hope you did. That means you had a really good high school teacher, or perhaps you've read it here. So let's move into the text itself a little more closely today. As I mentioned last time, the book was written in Haiti while Hurston was on that Guggenheim that I talked about, during which she was kind of trying to pull herself away from this significantly younger man that she'd fallen in love with. When she was a dweller in Harlem, and he was a graduate student at Columbia. So it was written in September of 1936 through March of 1937. In 7 weeks. Some of the characters: Phoebe Watson, Johnny Taylor, Logan Killix, Jody Starks, Nanny Crawford, Leafy, Marse Robert, Tea Cake, Janie Crawford. Thinking about, just in general terms, some of Hurston's accomplishment in this great book. Several elements for us to notice, and so we'll jump off from those. Notice, first of all, Hurston's amazing ear for heard language, its diction, its syntax, its idiomatic usages, its rhythms, its music. Remember Hurston's background in anthropology, in sociology, as a student of Franz Boas at Barnard, at Columbia. And remember too, all of those research trips to the South that she took as an undergraduate, and I should say as a graduate student working with Boas, and after as a postgraduate, student, I guess as a postgraduate, doing a postdoc, essentially, on Guggenheim and sponsored by various individuals and organizations in her trips to the South. I just wanted to draw your attention to, that word we use all the time, vernacular. Excuse me. That word we use all the time, vernacular. And we think of vernacular as everyday speech, that is the slanginess and the idiomatic usages and the rhythmic inflections of everyday speech, not particularly educated speech, not particularly literary or even literate speech, just the way people talk generally. Interesting word though. The word vernacular originally comes from, etymologically, I mean, comes from the Latin word verna, verna, which means slave. So vernacular originally is the language of the slaves. So, and this goes all the way back to Roman times when, you know, they would go out and conquer different areas and take back the men and women over whose nation they were victorious, and make them slaves. And so the vernacular was that sort of demotic, uh, very common, highly idiomatic language that their slaves spoke. Well, Hurston has a real gift for vernacular African American speech. I think it interested her uh, professionally as an anthropologist, and interested her personally as someone who simply loved the beauty of language, and it also interested her artistically as a literary artist, as somebody that um, earned her stock in trade as an artist that put together episodes built largely around the speech of other human beings, more specifically the vernacular speech of the regular folks, regular African American folks, that generally speaking, and in this book, almost exclusively her subject. Um, uh, and you know, think about um, what it means for Hurston to, in effect, require her readers to inhabit the linguistic realm of her characters to read the text. And it reminds you, we'll talk about this, but it reminds you a little bit of Benjamin and even Quentin, but I think particularly Benjamin because his is so difficult. You have to enter into Benjamin's world in order to understand even the simplest of events early in that novel. Um, you have to rely on Benjamin. And Benjamin's fractured, highly associative consciousness in order to make sense of what's happening to you as a reader. Just as also, you have to begin to understand who the different members of Dilsey's family were that were taking care of Benjamin at what time and in what place in order to make sense of that narrative as a whole, in an organic sense, in an integral sense. Well, by the same token, and depending on how you take the reading, Hurston either allows us to or forces us to, I think both at the same time, to have her world on her own linguistic terms as a writer. And those terms are rooted in African American vernacular English. You gotta, so to speak, you gotta learn to speak that language to get that book. And I don't know, was this part of what bothered Richard Wright about the book? I'm not sure that he would put it in that way, but it's such a, and maybe it's just that we're seeing this through 21st century eyes. Maybe it's just that I'm seeing it through, progressive white bald old man eyes in 2021 that I feel this way. But to me, it's so beautifully invitational. It's so beautifully welcoming. It doesn't immediately present you with an almost intractable and sometimes annoying uh, a challenge, the way that Faulkner's rendering of Benjamin does. And you read that and you just think, oh God, what the hell is going on? I'm going to have to read the whole book and go back and read that chapter again. So I finally get it, and that's what you do. That's what we do. Well, that has its charms, but it's intellectual charms, it's hermeneutic charms. But in Hurston, you're there. It's so welcoming. She brings you into the narrative, into that vernacular language with open arms. It seems to me a very generous kind of rendering, a very generous kind of representation of a particular American speech. And it reminds you a little bit of Twain as well. Twain does the same kind of thing in his work. And then I'm going to continue on this along this line, but you actually come to learn how a particular people at a particular place at a particular time in American cultural history actually spoke. I mean, you get a sense for idiomatic usages. You get a sense for sociologically, anthropologically, you get a sense for for the way that they constructed their language. And that it seems to me, not only is it really cool, it's really valuable historically. You guys agree with me? And it can be challenging, but it's particularly challenging for an old white man to read it out loud over Zoom. I mean, it's bad enough over a classroom to watch me try to do this without making a fool of myself. When I read the passages, which I will, it's always comic, just because I'm so bad at it. But it seems to me it's anthropologically very important and engaging and interesting. Okay. So what are the effects of this? The white bourgeois reader, on the one hand, has to inhabit an unfamiliar and defamiliarizing idiom. We use that term defamiliarizing. You may recognize that from other classes in your literary studies, but a text that defamiliarizes, or a work of art that defamiliarizes, is a work of art that resists your ability to know it to some degree. It's a work of art whose structures and whose modalities evade your sense of expectation, right? Disappoint your sense of expectation, elude your hermeneutic attempts to figure out what the hell is happening in it, right? That's what defamiliarizing art is. Art that keeps itself at a distance from you and disrupts your sense of righteous expectation, your sense of privileged expectation. Okay, and so that's what happens with the white bourgeois readers like me. For the African American reader, it seems to me that the vernacular, Black vernacular, African American vernacular, in this case Southern Black vernacular, is revealed in its beautiful poetry and its stirring power. And it seems to me, wow, there are not a lot of texts that accomplish both of those things, I don't think. And this text opened the doors. I mean, Alice Waters, when she rediscovered this text, or I shouldn't say rediscovered, opened, when Alice Waters discovered this text, she opened the doors to an entire narrative mode that, for all intents and purposes, had never been disclosed to young writers, I think in particular, young women writers of color. But I think just generally, I think as well, the generosity of the discourse became became apparent in ways that that have been profoundly influential over time. Let me take a drink here. Excuse me. I'm hoping some of this rain is going to tamp down the amazing pollen coating every single surface of our world, including, you know, the inside of both my nostrils and both my pulmonary chambers and my sinuses. I wouldn't have any other way, though, particularly after you read Wallace Stevens and you know, and then Zora Neale Hurston, both of whom had such a sense for the sex of biology, or for the sensual properties of our biological world and of our biological selves. I think they really understood the holiness of human sexuality and the holiness of the sexuality of our biological lives as part of this beautiful world that we seem hell-bent on taking from ourselves. And it's something you guys, all you young people know this. I'm preaching to the choir. But guys, we have to stop that. We have to stop it. You know, we have to stop it. We have to demand that it stops. That it stop. Okay. Yeah. Good. Yeah, I think that's enough on that topic. Now let's also think about another thing that happens on the level of narration. Did you notice as you're reading this text, there are these wonderful shifts from a kind of a straight up third person narrative, third person narration, he, she, pardon me, from a third person narration to what seems to be a blend of the first and third person. Yeah. And we've seen versions of this before. You remember, and I didn't want to name it then. I just wanted to introduce it and let it kind of wash over us and let us respond to it as a tabula rasa, you know, as a blank slate, and then talk more about it with more specificity later on. Well, now's that later on. But you remember when we were reading Stein, and you'd read those. Usually, there were very long paragraphs, and they'd be describing, say, Mrs. Creeder observing Lena, and the paragraph would begin very clearly in the third person. And the language was objective. The language was somewhat reportorial. The language was somewhat flat, not in a negative way, but just in a sort of a straight up declarative, prosaic way. But then as the paragraph continued, you'd notice in about the 6th or 7th line of this lengthy paragraph, these subjective flourishes, this subjective elan would be slowly injected, lexical choice by lexical choice, lexical choice by syntactical organization, until the subjectivity, that is the emotional life of the person reported to be speaking this direct quotation, the emotional life of that person would begin to suffuse the reportorial third person prose. And it kind of, and this is one of Stein's innovations, it seems to. I don't think anybody did it before Stein. Not that I have discovered, not in the same way. Very adventurous. Stein's very important for that reason. And it's something that I feel that women writers have greater access to. Don't ask me to explain that. I hope that doesn't sound prejudicial, but I think women writers have had historically a better sense for the appropriateness of the representation of emotion in linguistic choices. I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, but it's certainly the case in Stein, and I think she was a great innovator of it. But you see it, immediately afterward in Joyce, and you see it slightly after that in Woolf, and so on. But you see it very powerfully in Hurston. This is called. There's actually a technical name for this narrative mode: free indirect discourse. I'm just going to let you write that down. Free indirect discourse. Let me define that for you. I actually have some language here that I want to read because it's a technical designation that I'd like you to know. Free indirect discourse. It's a narrative mode of represented speech and thought. And you find it in Stein, Joyce, Faulkner, Woolf, Hurston, Morrison. It's a third person narrative mode, and this is hence the indirect of free indirect discourse. It's indirect in the sense that it's third person, right? It's an indirect speech. It's a third person narrative mode in which the narration is suffused with first person, unmediated, intellectual and emotional associations. Now that, suffused with first person, unmediated, intellectual and emotional associations, hence the free indirect discourse. The result is an admixture of the objective and subjective in a single narrative mode. An admixture of the mediated and the unmediated in a single narrative mode. An admixture, indeed, of the reportorial and the emotionally rich in a single narrative mode. Okay, let me just read that all again, just to make sure you get it. Free indirect discourse represent a narrative mode of represented speech and thought. A third person, hence the indirect, a third person narrative mode in which the narration is suffused with first person, unmediated, intellectual and emotional associations, hence the free indirect discourse. The result is an admixture of objective and subject, of the objective and the subjective in a single narrative mode, the mediated and the unmediated in a single narrative mode, the reportorial and the emotionally replete in a single narrative mode. Everybody get that? So when you come across free indirect discourse, I find it very powerful because it's as though the speaker, it's hard to say. It's because it's textual, right? Clearly textual, but also clearly characterological. It belongs to both text and character. It belongs to the reportorial as well as the emotional at exactly the same time. And it's as though it's a narrative mode that refuses to occupy I have language on this. It refuses to occupy the given narrative categories that have been made available to us by conventional notions of narrative. In other words, conventional notions of how you write books, how you write quotations, how you write indirect quotations, right? I say quotations. How you a direct quote would be a quote that's actually spoken by a person. An indirect quote would be a quote that is I'm using the word quote. A direct quotation would be a quotation that's actually spoken by a person. Indirect speech in a novel would be the stuff that isn't spoken by a particular character. You know, it's indirect, it's not attributed to a particular character. But the point of free and direct discourse is that despite the fact that it's indirect, the speakerly voice, in other words, and I think I said character before, but it's not, you know, it's not so much, not necessarily even character, but just the speakerly voice, the narrative voice of that particular section becomes emotionally replete, becomes emotionally engaged. And that reportorial distance defeats itself. And of course, this is something that's accomplished intentionally by the writer. So you have this cool narrative mode that will neither occupy the world of reportorial narration, indirect, and the world of the characterological. That is the world of real people that are rich with sorry, just got a message, that are rich with emotions, an emotional life, full of emotional life. So it's a really cool mode. Just to finish up, I have some language on this. There's a great African-American, he's one of my very favorite critics. He's one of the people that got me started writing on African-American film. When I read his great book, The Signifying Monkey, Henry Louis Gates. If you haven't read The Signifying Monkey, make sure you do that. It's just if you're interested in African-American literature, African-American culture, or if you want to teach it well on the high school level, on the secondary level, or on the tertiary level, make sure you take a look at that book. I find it hugely important. Henry Louis Gates calls free indirect discourse a divided voice, or he also calls it a double voice unreconciled, a divided voice, a double voice unreconciled, refusing, that's what I was saying earlier, refusing polarities, exhibiting and this is very important, I have the language on this here. I was alluding to it before. It's in my consciousness. I love it so much. It's sort of part of the way I think of literature and speech generally, explanation generally. You know, truth be told, I found this very liberating to me as a teacher. I know several of you are interested in going on to teach primary, a couple of you primary, a couple of you secondary, a couple of you tertiary, college level. And I've actually found it very liberating because with this, and Hurston was the one who gave it to me. You know, I didn't understand it fully until I read Hurston, which was really, I never read Hurston in graduate school. God help me. I don't see how you emerge with a PhD in English literature without having read Zora Neale Hurston, but she wasn't taught in the 80s when I was where I was, and that was a real deficit. I felt it as I was embarrassed by it when I finally read Hurston at a graduate student of mine's insistence. I read it and I just thought, oh my God, well, you know, what curriculum doesn't give this to us? Be that as it may, as a teacher, I suddenly realized that you could provide information in a very strict, reportorial, disciplined, factual, demanding way, but also include in that seriousness of purpose, that directness, that insistence on real knowledge, real hard knowledge, you know, the kind of knowledge you can put on a multiple choice test, for example. You could blend that with the emotional, you could you could blend that form of lecture with the emotional effects of the text on you. You didn't have to keep those effects, those emotional effects under a bushel when you got. And I'm speaking to you not as teacher student here, but as teacher teacher. Um, or even if you're going into law, for example, if anybody wants to litigate, or really anything that you do in front of people, um, it's very effective to realize that, yeah, you can be responsible to the intellectual demands of the subject, whatever it may be, in a disciplined way, in a serious way, with all due professionalism. But you can also embody the emotional life, the emotional effects, the emotional implications of the intellectual world that you've entered into when you read, for example, a novel. And that can be part of our, that can inflect our affect when we're up in front of people, and that makes what we have to say all the more vivid, all the more meaningful, all the more alive, right? And the beautiful thing is it's utterly authentic. It's not a put on, it's not a mask, it's not a dance that you do. It's actually a living, authentic expression of the way you feel when you read certain stuff and when you think about it and when you think about the implications of certain ideas. Very powerful. It's life, to me, it's life changing. And Hurston, almost uniquely, I guess I had a couple of teachers in graduate school and in undergraduate school. I had one teacher in undergraduate and one teacher in particular in graduate school that kind of embodied this, never referring to Hurston. I think it was just their own family backgrounds that did this for them. But Hurston opens that door for us. So in this free and direct discourse, you hear a defiance of the conventional categories of narration available to the narrative voice of a story. Categories, another way of thinking of it, categories of telling, conventional categories of telling, prescribed or proscribed by racist patriarchy. You see that? Let me just give that to you again, because it's good language. It's not often that I can actually express an idea in writing in a way that's lucid. So I have to jump on it when I can. In free and direct discourse, you discover a defiance of the conventional categories of narration available to the narrative voice of a story, categories of telling prescribed or proscribed by racist patriarchy. Do you see? So free and direct discourse can liberate us from the cultural status quo that's inflicted upon us by, in our case, a white supremacist patriarchy. And I don't think you have to be gay or black or a woman or any combination of those beautiful things to partake of it, because it's a way of defying categorization. It's a way of saying, look, for example, as a teacher, think of yourself as a secondary school teacher or as a college teacher. I defy the categories of professional expectation that you hold over me. I'm doing it this way. This is the way I do it, and it's successful. You see? And it speaks to people very deeply because it combines the factual and the emotional in a very vigorous and innovative and challenging way. Make sense? Check it on time here. Excuse me. Okay. Notice too, so we're going over remarkable elements of Hurston's accomplishment, or several elements to notice. We've been through a couple. Notice too, the racial self-sufficiency of the narrative. I'm just thinking, I know I do this all the time, I'm sorry, but thinking about free and direct discourse, that's jazz. That's exactly what jazz is. And Henry Louis Gates makes this point. He compares Zora Neale Hurston to John Coltrane. So you have the jazz musician will inherit, say, one of the great songs of the American popular ballad tradition, or from the great musical theater of England and America. For example, the great Julie Andrews performed song from Sound of Music. You remember that? My Favorite Things. Bum 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 bum. Right. So that's Rodgers and Hammerstein, and you know exactly the way that goes, right? Coltrane hears that song and renders it in this musical language that gives it, the only word for it, that gives it a swing that you never knew was there in the first place. And suddenly you feel yourself pop, and for Julie Andrews, it's bum 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 bum. Bum 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 bum, all hitting those quarter notes, every time. For Coltrane, it's bum bum ba bum bum ba bum bum ba da da bum 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 bum. And you start hearing that, and it God help you, it changes the way you walk. I mean, you used to walk around like Julie Andrews, but now you walk around like John Coltrane. Now you walk around like Billie Holiday. Now you walk around like Sarah Vaughan. You see, and just a new, much richer, much more, I use the term advisedly, soulful mode of being in the world. And it's a beautiful damn thing, And this is what Hurston does. Just take a look at the great Henry Louis Gates chapter on Hurston and Coltrane, if you're interested in this, right? Okay. You see what I just did there, pedagogically, that's free and direct discourse. I learned it from Hurston, damn it. So there's the discipline side. What multiple choice questions are going to come out of this, right? But then there's also what is my heart learning from this great piece of literature? In what ways is my soul being enriched by this great work of literature? How does this change me in a way that will actually affect, my children? How does this alter my sense of my own humanity? And it seems to me, y'all, as teachers, we got to embody that. We got to take that with us. There's that great word. See, I'm doing it again. It's Coltrane. It's my favorite things taken to a different key. Or not a different key, but a different sense of time, a different sense of rhythm, different sense of voice, different mode of expressivity. There's that word enthusiasm. Enthusiasm. You know what it comes from? The en comes from in, right? In, within, and then thu, the thu comes from theos, God. So enthusiasm is literally a God within, and this is the kind of holiness that you feel rising in you when you feel yourself, for example, reading a book, or for example, hearing a piece of music that moves you to want to talk about it with people and want to report it factually, yes, but also want to report its emotional resonance. And that requires, or that doesn't even require, it's the wrong word, that begets enthusiasm. And it's utterly authentic. It's like a sexual, paging Dr. Freud. it is a form of secular holiness, a form of secular theogony. Another thing to notice about this great book is the racial self-sufficiency of this narrative. Do you notice there's no white people in this book? There's no easy racialized drama in this book. This is an intramural, racially intramural work. Now, what are the consequences of this? What are the ramifications of this approach by Faulkner, by Hurston? That is, this choice of hers to keep her narrative and its episodes and its characters within the circle of African American life in this time and in this place. What is the logic there? What are the ramifications of that authorial choice? Well, we can't help but recognize the complexity with which Hurston imbues the issue of race by this move. She emphasizes the plurality, the multivalence of perspective, the diversity of discourse within Black culture itself. You know, it's as if she's saying, this is enough. There is adequate intellection, there's adequate emotional life for us to engage with it and study it and celebrate it infinitely. That's how complex we are. That's how engaging we are. That's how human we are. You see? The effect of this is to subvert the monolithic quality that dominant culture, dominant white supremacist culture in this case, dominant patriarchy in this case, to subvert the monolithic quality that dominant culture ascribes to marginalized cultures of all kinds. Hurston reveals the contradictions, yes, the hypocrisies, yes, the self-deceptions, yes, within Black culture, along with its beauty, yes, its intelligence, yes, its sensitivity, yes, its compassion. In its complexity resides its humanity. Hurston insists upon reporting this intramural complexity because therein we discover as African Americans, we discover as Southerners, we discover as Americans, we discover as women, we discover as men our own beautiful humanity. Very powerful. Okay, I'm going to actually stop the Hurston there. We haven't been able to do jazz during Faulkner. There's just too much there, and I didn't want to overstay my welcome with you all. So I want to get back to the jazz because it's important. to our meanings here. Um, and let me just. I want to talk about Billie Holiday here. Give me a second. It's just like a regular class, isn't it? As you wait for the professor to find his place. Okay. On December 30th, 1938, Cafe Society, a nightclub like no other, opened its doors just off Washington Square in Greenwich Village. So Greenwich Village is in the southern part of Manhattan, way below Central Park. It's not near Harlem. Harlem, north of Central Park, north of 120th Street. Greenwich Village toward the southern end of Manhattan, of the island. It was the creation of an ex-shoe salesman named Barney Josephson, who hoped, with John Hammond's help, to demonstrate that New Yorkers would turn out to hear jazz presented, quote, with dignity and respect, unquote, before a genuinely integrated audience. He billed it as the wrong place for the right people, and it was a hit, not only with those who shared his liberal politics, but even with some of the society people its slogan was meant to lampoon. Billie Holiday was on the first bill. Hammond had convinced Josephson to hire her, and she stayed for almost 9 months, doing 3 shows a night, backed by the trumpeter Frankie Newton's band. In April of 1939, a young leftist high school teacher named Abel Meeropol turned up at the club to see her. He had written a poem and set it to music, he said. Would she sing it? It was about lynching and the picture it painted of innocent victims of Southern mob violence hanging from poplar trees, faces distorted in death, blood spattered on the roots, was brutal in its candor. Holiday called herself, quote unquote, a race woman. So in other words, if you thought of yourself as a race woman or a race man, what that meant was you were interested in and engaged with African American cultural issues, the role of African America in American life, and with the pursuit of civil rights. In other words, you were engaged politically. That's what it meant. You were engaged politically, socially, artistically in your African American identity. She called herself a race woman, but she was frankly reluctant to try the song at first. It was completely different from anything she'd ever sung before, and it was grim beyond measure. I was scared people would hate it, she said. The first time I sang it, I thought it was a mistake. There wasn't even a patter of applause when I finished. Then a lone person began clapping nervously. Then suddenly, everybody was clapping. The song and Holiday's chilling rendition of it caused a sensation. A few customers walked out. One woman who cried out, "Don't you ever dare ever sing that song again. Don't you dare," turned out to have witnessed a lynching as a little girl and had found it unbearable to be reminded of it in the nightclub. Holiday would consider strange fruit her own for the rest of her life. It's my song, she said. It has a way of separating the straight people from the squares. The straight, I don't know how to say that exactly, the straight people from the squares. It's the last time the word straight was used to describe somebody who wasn't square. It had a way of separating the straight people from the squares. She sometimes claimed to have written it herself, which was not true. Once, when the folk singer Josh White dared perform it at Cafe Society, she threatened to slit his throat if he ever tried it there again.
Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh, then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the tree to drop. Here is a strange and bitter crop.
Drop me off in Harlem, any place in Harlem. There's someone waiting there who makes it seem like heaven up in Harlem. I don't want your Dixie, you can keep your Dixie. There's nothing down in Dixie that can take the place of my old Harlem. Harlem has those southern skies, they're in my baby's smile. I idolize my baby's eyes, her classy uptown style. If Harlem moved to China, There'd be nothing finer than to stow away on a plane someday and let 'em drop me off in Harlem. Harlem has those southern skies. They're in my baby's smile. I idolize my baby's eyes, her classy uptown style. If Harlem moved to China, there'd be nothing finer than to stow away on a plane someday and let 'em drop me on